Good morning readers, it's Tilly here from Tilly's Shelf and welcome to another bookish breakfast. So this time last week, or perhaps a little tiny bit earlier, I attempted a very rushed review of Belinda by Maria Edgeworth and didn't really get to the end of the review because I had to leave for work. So I thought today I would go into it in a little bit more depth, I suppose. So last week I started on talking about how some of the characters were, I suppose, particularly interesting, maybe stood out a little bit more from the norms of society that we expect from the time and the norms that we see in Jane Austen's novels. Obviously, I read this for Jane Austen July as part of the prompt to read a book by a contemporary author, a contemporary of Jane Austen. So yeah, we started talking about Harriet Freke. So Harriet Freke, just in case you missed that video, is a character who dresses as a boy whenever she can. She refers to herself as a schoolboy at one point, and then corrects herself to schoolgirl. She has a lot of close friendships with women and shown to be maybe slightly distant from her husband, and generally she doesn't conform to the expectations of what a woman should be like, and she is definitely presented as being the baddie character. So her surname is Freke, spelt F-R-E-K-E, but I don't think the sound of that is coincidental. So there's other characters, for instance there's a character called Delacour, who obviously of the heart, and she is shown as being, you know, really filled with feeling and eventually kind of has a bit of a redemption arc. She has a very quite an interesting transition from being kind of a bad and manipulative character to eventually being redeemed and having a happy ending. Harriet Freke doesn't get that. And there's another character called Percival, and I think the use of the name Percival and like the links to sort of Arthurian legend and so on is an indication that this character is a good character. So I think Edgeworth really uses her characters' names and surnames to kind of suggest what she thinks of them. So yeah, I found it really intriguing to have a character like this presented so strongly and being such a force within the book and shown to really have an influence, or definitely try to have an influence on the characters around her, and the way that they see themselves and act in society. So she tries to act on the main character and tries to, I suppose, challenge her preconceived notions of what a woman should be like and what a woman should act like. There is a very vibrant discussion scene that I referred to last week. I wonder if I can find it. I did tab some things, but stupidly tabbed them all with the same colour tabs, so that might make things a little bit difficult to find the different things. Oh yeah, so they have this debate about female delicacy and the delicacy of the sex, and the level of education, I suppose, that women have, and Harriet Freke's argument is that women feel shame, and women are forced to feel shame, and women's shame is something that leads them towards vice, because they're pushed down this path of, if you're guilty of one thing, I suppose, then you are guilty of more and more things, and that female delicacy is compared to slavery. Mrs. Freke says, by talking to them of the delicacy of their sex, this delicacy enslaves the pretty delicate dears. And when somebody counters that, she replies, I hate slavery, vive la liberté, I am a champion for the rights of women, which I believe is a reference to A Vindication of the Rights of Women by Mary Wollstonecraft, which came out about 10 years before that book. I think it was 1792, The Vindication of the Rights of Women came out. This was 1801. And I found it quite interesting that she refers to slavery. Oh, that was the other thing that I meant to look up, see if there was any more references to slavery, which there definitely were, to compare the position of women to slavery. And part of this book that I'm going to come to in a little bit kind of talks about how women are forced into certain roles by men, and the lack of agency that they are sometimes given within this story, sometimes in quite unrealistic manners, but yeah, we'll come to that in a bit. So yeah, I found Mrs. Freke to be a really interesting character, and particularly this debate and this discussion that they have about delicacy in women's positions. I thought that was really interesting to see it discussed. And the role in the book is that Mrs. Freak says all of this stuff to Belinda, and Belinda re-examines, by being pushed by Mrs. Freak, she then re-examines her own moral values, and she goes from being somebody who kind of passively accepts the morals that she has been given and the things that have been suggested to her, to examining her own values and examining what she thinks of as right or wrong. And the conclusion is that she decides that Mrs. Freak is wrong. But I thought it was interesting to see that even if maybe she's not presented as a character that you're supposed to agree with, she's presented as somebody who has arguments that have to be thought about and responded to. So yeah, so I wanted to move on to a little bit more of the slavery side of things, because like I said, Mrs. Freak refers to slavery. I've been reading Mansfield Park this month and watching the various adaptations, and I find it really interesting that we are trying so hard in certain cases. We're trying so hard to find stuff about colonialism and slavery in Mansfield Park, and it's there. It's definitely there. We've got the estate in Antigua. We've got like a little question that Fanny Price asks, and we don't actually know exactly what she said, but the references are there, and you can definitely say that there's stuff going on in the background there. But it's not going on in the background here. Maria Edgeworth is confident enough on her grasp of current events, confident enough, I guess, of her political opinions, that she is willing to bring some of that debate actually into her book. And it's not just like the occasional quiet line. Well, it's not like it's a central theme of the book, but it definitely comes up a lot more. So there's one point, and I forgot to look it up, but where a selection of the good characters read aloud to each other from a poem called The Dying Negro, which was an abolitionist poem written at the time that had increasing popularity and was one of the kind of cultural representations of the abolitionist movement. That was all about talking about, I suppose, the rights of this individual, and the beginning of a change in opinion about slavery. There is also a character who you could interpret a couple of different ways, and that character is Mr. Vincent, and he is the second love interest for the main character. I'm trying to do this review without any spoilers, but I think there's certain, so nothing that I'm going to say is going to spoil the plot or the ending, but there's just certain themes that I wanted to pick up on, and that's going to mention kind of hints of the plot, I suppose. So yeah, Mr. Vincent is the second love interest of the character, and I just wanted to tell you a little bit about how Mr. Vincent is described. So he's called a Creole. So a Creole, I believe, would be somebody of mixed race heritage for a lot of the 19th century at least. At this point in the 19th, 20th century, at this point at the very beginning of the 18th century, sorry, I'm getting my centuries muddled up, in 1801, I don't know whether Creole would have meant somebody with a mixed race background, or whether it would have meant a European descent person who was had grown up and was completely based in the West Indies. But furthermore about Mr. Vincent, it said that he has large dark eyes and a manly sunburnt complexion. So when I read this, my interpretation was that he was that he had some family from that were black, going back in his family tree at least, and I saw him as a mixed race character, which to me I found that really interesting. Whether or not I was right, obviously you can debate that. But I think it fits with the way that he's portrayed in the book, including maybe some slightly stereotypical and negative ways that he's portrayed within the book. I think he's got a huge fortune, a West Indian fortune of huge amounts, and I think we've seen form in books of that time that if a character had a large fortune, it didn't necessarily matter what their racial heritage was. So in Jane Austen's own Sanditon, we have Miss Lamb, who is described as being half mulatto. So I think we can pretty definitely conclude what her racial background is. And I think sometimes we should maybe take the opportunity to have these characters instead of ignoring the possibility that was there. If somebody was to adapt this, it gives them a very good excuse to cast because people sometimes make arguments against having diversity in casting and, you know, wanting everything to be kind of fit a certain vision, I suppose, of Regency England. And this, I think there is enough in this book that you can you can change that vision slightly and challenge that idea of Regency England as being this entirely white place, which it definitely wasn't. So yeah, the thing about Mr. Vincent is that he is shown as, or described as, having a noble spirit, as well as a noble fortune. And I think this is kind of before the idea of, before the noble savage idea had been kind of put into words. So I don't think that that word in itself was like a reference to that. But there is definitely this impression that we get of Mr. Vincent as being noble and good, but in many ways naive. He is shown as being wanting to adopt the styles of Europe and wanting to be accepted into fashionable high Regency society, but also as being, naive and not very aware of what he's doing, and potentially a bit almost morally ignorant, which is what I mean about maybe some negative stereotyping coming from his West Indian background. It's like he's not fully equipped for the society that he is intending to join. There are also further references to other people who are described as Creole, and in particular Creole ladies are described as being indolent and ignorant, which is charming, just plain charming. So yeah, I just find it interesting to have that, I guess, more openly discussed. And then Mr. Vincent has a servant who, I guess, when he was back in the West Indies would have been a slave. And this servant is called Juba. And Juba is very definitely black, and also comes in for a fair share of racial stereotypes and descriptions. It felt like I like to talk about this because like I said, it challenges this idea that we had that Regency society was exclusively white. And I also think, if I'm recommending this book, and I would recommend this book, I found it a very interesting read. I want you to know and go in forewarned is forearmed, to I guess see what you're going to be reading. So Juba is described repeatedly as, you know, his black, like entirely in terms of possession. He's not often dignified with, you know, any kind of humanizing vocabulary. So it's a very limited portrayal of Juba. He's got a speaking part, so, you know, you could say that's a good thing. But he is, it's a limited character. So he's shown as being talented. He's a musician. He writes music. He makes musical instruments. So he has his definite skills, and he is also shown as being brave. Towards the end, he's described as a man of courage, which is the nicest thing that gets said about him. My door's about to slam, like the wind's just bringing it around. Okay, maybe it's not. But on the other hand, he's just like shown as being like unfailingly loyal because he's basically ignorant and he's been brought up. The only master he's ever known is Mr. Vincent, and so he's kind of been brought up to be loyal to this one person. And he's shown as being a bit dim and superstitious, and described as being, in one point, compared to being a devil. And he has the same name as Mr. Vincent's dog, which I guess shows the position that he is given. Even though he is shown as being loved and valued, I suppose, in the role as a servant, his position is effectively the same position as the dog. So I guess it's good to see just a bit more detail and a bit more perspective of race relations at the time in a novel, which is also enjoyable for reading as a novel. I found it interesting. So moving on and moving back to kind of the position of women, I didn't plan this video fully enough for the moving between the themes. I just wanted to talk about the little bit at the end of the book. It's only a little bit at the end of the book, where it kind of goes into My Fair Lady. So I read My Fair Lady with no, not My Fair Lady, what was it called? Pygmalion, which was then turned into the film My Fair Lady. So Pygmalion is a play by George Bernard Shaw, and I read it with Ros for discussing drama, I think 2 months ago now, so I will try to link to that video below. But essentially in Pygmalion, a young uninformed girl is plucked from obscurity by a wealthy man who decides to teach her things and bring her up to be the ideal lady, but just as kind of like a bit of an experiment. And that happens here. So the romantic hero, the guy who's the good guy, picks this random girl, decides that he wants to bring her up to be his wife by cutting her off from the rest of the society, I suppose, and making sure that she's only taught the things that he wants her to be taught. But he does do her the credit of saying, I'm sure she can be taught anything. And he keeps her in just a little house by herself with one lady. He doesn't let her meet anyone in society, and the book says that she doesn't mind this, but I feel like she doesn't really have a proper appreciation of the choice that's being put on her. The really strong thing is he doesn't like her name that she's been living with for, like 15, 16 years. He doesn't like it, so he changes it. It doesn't really matter, does it? And yeah, prevents us from seeing society, and he sees her as this child of nature. And I think that idea of the child of nature is set up in strong contrast to Harriet Freke, who is a child of society, who has, read widely these like political and controversial texts, who has been engaged actively in debating about things. So we have the contrast, we have the child of nature who is completely blissful ignorance presented as being the good thing to be, I suppose. And this young girl eventually does get a little bit of a fight back. She gets a little bit of an opportunity to say, this isn't right. My favourite line in the book is when she turns around and says to the man who has been educating her, do you think I cannot feel without being taught? And yeah, so she gets that moment, very much like the young woman in Pygmalion, of pointing out that actually it's not, her character isn't entirely dependent on the man who has just decided to educate her and then kind of got a bit bored and wished he hadn't taken on the project. So I liked that empowerment moment that she got, but then she ends up, slight spoiler I suppose, she's not a main character, but she ends up married to a man who stalked her in bushes and stared at her that she's never actually met, but somehow she fell in love with his portrait. It's strange how these things happen. And in between these things, I suppose, in between Harriet Freke and in between Lady Delacour with her kind of redemption arc that I mentioned, and this young girl who is brought up in complete ignorance, in between all that we have the ideal of perfect womanhood, which is Belinda. And she is shown as being a blend of innocence, country innocence. I was thinking of doing a video at some point this month about country girls and town girls, and the differences between them in Regency writing. So she was brought up out in the sticks in the countryside, and that means that she's been brought up with a value for home as opposed to society. So the perfect woman has a good value for home. But unlike the young girl, she has at least a proper knowledge of the world and a proper moral understanding developed by having to debate with characters that have different moral views from her. But she's managed to still hold on to those lovely notions of female delicacy, and that makes her the ideal figure that everyone should want to marry, and that girls should aspire to be like, I suppose. And yeah, she has the ability to resist temptation when she is tempted by Harriet Freke to kind of go gallivanting off into society. She is able to resist that temptation, whereas the young girl who has been brought up in ignorance doesn't have the proof of having resisted temptation, because she doesn't know that at one point she's offered a diamond or a flower, I think, a choice between a diamond or a flower. She doesn't know that a diamond's worth anything, so it's not a fair choice, I suppose. It doesn't represent a true temptation because she doesn't know what she's being offered when she's being tempted, I suppose, is the implication from the book. So to sum up, Belinda was interesting for these characters. Narratively, in terms of plot, it is quite flawed. every great crisis in the book is somehow averted. There is a whole period in the book which is quite a good period that is interesting and has some suspense, where a character is in peril. I don't want to say too much about it because it would be a spoiler, but that peril is just eventually kind of negated, and a lot of the tension that you do get is just kind of dropped. And I didn't like that so much. Yeah, not a lot happens. I can't remember whether I said this in my previous video, but it's a bit like Mansfield Park in that you've got this perfect moral girl at the centre, and stuff goes on around her, including some fairly scandalous things, and she just kind of sits there and watches it all and judges people, but she's just not as engaging a character as Fanny Price is. If you didn't like Mansfield Park and you didn't find Fanny Price engaging, then I would say you probably won't like Belinda as a character. You might enjoy the other characters that surround her, such as Lady Delacour, but yeah, you probably won't think that much of Belinda. I'm not sure that I did either. She's a bit of a goody two-shoes. Yeah, there is, sort of a lack of exciting plot. Other books that I've read at the time, even excluding Jane Austen's works, which have their own special kinds of tension and plot mechanics, but books like The Mysteries of Udolpho and Self-Control by Mary Brunton, and Evelina and Cecilia by Frances Burney, they all tend to put their heroines through really significant trials, to the point of being abducted to America and things like that. Like, young women in these books go through a huge amount of difficulty. I think Jane Austen laughs about the driven to the despair that a third volume can offer. Can't remember the exact quote in Northanger Abbey. And there is just not that intensity, I suppose, in Belinda. There is nothing really dramatic that happens. You never feel like Belinda's really in danger, apart from potentially she might marry somebody who's not absolutely perfect, but then in the end she kind of does anyway. So yeah, it was a little bit weak from that respect. The reason that I read Belinda, that I've wanted to read Belinda for a long time, is that it is referred to by Jane Austen. I was going to look that up actually and find out more details, but in Northanger Abbey, it's one of the books that Jane Austen says, oh, it is only Belinda, when she's talking about young women being presented as not reading novels, or that they shouldn't read novels, and novel reading actually comes up quite a lot in this book. And for instance, this young girl who's being educated is not allowed to read novels because reading novels would obviously be bad for her education. Whereas I suppose the good balance that Belinda has is that she reads some novels, but not many novels, because she's more interested in all of those good books that young ladies are supposed to want to read, and poetry and history and all of that stuff. And I believe Harriet Freke talks about reading novels as well. Yeah, that was something I meant to look into a bit more, but I forgot. This is, although Jane Austen used it as one of her examples of novels, Maria Edgeworth claimed that it was not a novel. I believe she called it a moral text or a moral story. Let's see whether I can find it at the start. No. Yeah, no, I can't. Yeah, so she claimed that it was not a novel. It definitely is a novel. But yeah, I think she was trying to give her work a little bit more status by saying that it was not, because obviously novels were at some points judged and condemned. Including within this novel by this author, who I'd imagine was one of the people that Jane Austen was really taking a swing at in that Northanger Abbey quote. So anyway, that was a bit disorganised and a bit vague, but those were some of my thoughts on Belinda. I would love to know whether somebody else has read it and what they thought of it, and whether they got very far with it, and yeah, how they would interpret the character of Mr. Vincent, and whether they agree with some of the things I said. Oh, the character that I forgot to mention is Solomon the Jew. And this is a character who comes in for about one scene. There is absolutely no nuance in this character. He is presented as a malicious moneylender, in a very anti-Semitic manner. Yeah, that's just worth saying, given that we were talking about, I guess, racial relations and racial presentations presentations of characters in relation to their race. Yeah, that happens. So I'm sorry about that. But yeah, I can't really think of. I in no way excuse the racial language that is used in this book, but it is a book that was written at a very different time, and when reading it, I guess, like I was saying, we look at how those characters are portrayed rather than taking it as rather than accepting the way that those characters are portrayed. It doesn't mean that we should throw away the book, it just means that we should read it and think about it, I suppose. Anyway, so I hope that wasn't too convoluted, and yeah, I'm just interested to hear thoughts on this or thoughts on this review, or other books that deal with similar interesting themes from the Regency period. I know some people are reading A Woman of Colour, which features a black woman as the main character, as far as I understand, so I'm going to try and get hold of that to read that at another time. So thank you very much for watching, and take care.